All of us on Robben Island at that time had no idea whether we would ever get off the island. But we heard of a church in Chicago on the south side that had a sign, Free South Africa. And we made a pact that if any of us ever got off that island and could get to the States, we would come here to America, we would come to Chicago and thank you.
I told them about how much we learned and how much we were inspired by the struggles that they were waging here. But it was for me a fresh experience to know just how much was specifically focused on inspiring South Africans never to stop and never to give up.
When Nelson Mandela visited Chicago in 1993, 3 years after he was freed from a South African prison, it was an exciting moment for the city. But most people don't know the whole story about the Chicago churches and grassroots activists who worked for years on behalf of the anti-apartheid movement. Dr. Ava Greenwell's documentary, Mandela in Chicago, is a deep dive into the many twists and turns leading to his visit. Dr. Greenwell, we welcome you to Different Drummers. What inspired you to make this documentary?
Back in 2014, I took over what we call at Northwestern the South Africa Journalism Residency Program. And this is where students who are journalism majors go and work at a news organization for an entire quarter. And so my predecessor has said, hey, I'm going to retire soon. Why don't you take over this program? And I said, great, I've never been to South Africa before. This will give me an opportunity to learn some things about it. And so in that process, as part of the preparation, there's a prep course that my predecessor, Lauren Guglione, taught. And so I would be teaching that class as well. And so he would bring in occasionally somebody in the Chicago area who had had a connection to South Africa or the anti-apartheid movement in some way. And so I began to bring some of those same people in my class, and they said, oh, well, do you know so-and-so? You got to talk to so-and-so because, you know, they really know more than I know. And so it was really the snowball effect where before you knew it, there were all these people. This is 2014. And then I also started to get involved with, I was chosen as a fellow for the Diverse Voices in Documentary program, which is produced by Cartemco Film Company. And their goal is really to get more people of color on behind the camera, actually making films. And so between those two things, 2014 and then 2016, becoming a Diverse Voices in Doc fellow, I thought, okay, I know the perfect project to work on because now I know these folks. And I also know that their story has never been told before. And, you know, that's really the mark of good storytelling as well, is to tell something people have never heard about before. And I also felt that the Midwest had really gotten short shrift as it relates to the anti-apartheid movement. We hear a lot about the East Coast, New York, DC, West Coast, Los Angeles, but not a whole lot about Chicago. And the other thing is, you know, this was also during a time where Chicago was getting a lot of negative publicity from the former president about violence in the city. And so people nationally and internationally might think that that's the only thing that's happening in the Chicago, and we know it's not. And so that was also my goal, to really show that the people, most of the people in Chicago really are thinking about good things and how they can make life better for other people, not just in their own backyards, but around the world. And I thought it was important to tell that story. And again, to make a short story even longer, or a long story even longer, I also knew that a lot of the folks who had really been involved in their 30s and 40s back in the 1980s, they're getting older. And, you know, they're going to pass away. And if we don't tell their stories and allow them to tell it the way they want it to be told, then we'll never get that story. And so I think you'll see from the documentary at the end, there are two people, that was at the time of production, who had passed away. Since that time, two more people have passed away. So now four of the people in the documentary, Buzz Palmer, Conrad Worrell, Ora Shu, and Harold Rogers, have passed away. And so I probably was one of the last persons to actually interview them, you know, about this subject. And so I'm really proud that I was able to get them into the piece before they passed away.
Wow, I love how organically that came together. And I too am so thankful that you were able to capture their voices and really lift them up in this way through your documentary before they passed on. So, speaking of all of those key people and wonderful voices that you were able to uplift, who were the major players in the Chicago anti-apartheid movement?
So I would say SITSA, the Coalition for Illinois Divestment in South Africa. They were one of the main organizations. There were at one time more than 20 organizations that sort of came under this umbrella of the Free South Africa movement that was happening in Chicago. And I think you'll see in the documentary where some of these protests had taken place in front of the South African consulate, how you would see signs from various churches. I mean, there's a list of all these churches that were involved, Reba Church in Evanston, synagogues, churches on the South Side. Other organizations that today we would call social justice organizations were also involved. And I think, again, here's one of these things that we tend to not really remember, and that is these coalitions came together for one sole purpose, and that was putting attention on this horrible system that, really denigrated people and made for poverty and inequality and all those things that we talk about today. And they could be a part of that movement to try to change things. And I think that's really what was important. The other thing is this in some ways was a multiracial coalition. There were Blacks and whites and Hispanics, Latinos who were also involved. There was some gender parity or some attempts to have some gender parity there. And so when we think about all the things that we talk about today, I like to think of the anti-apartheid movement in Chicago, sort of sandwiched in between the civil rights movement coming from the 50s and the 60s and 70s, and this Black Lives Matter movement, the movement that we're living in right now. And so I just think in terms of the main characters, I wanted to make sure that it wasn't just the people you automatically go to, the people you've heard of, like your Jesse Jacksons. Okay, he's in the documentary, but he's not the only one in the documentary. There are other people, frontline people, rank and file, who are really on the front lines. And those were the people that I really wanted to highlight in the doc.
And what was the role of the church in the Chicago anti-apartheid movement?
So it was really interesting. I grew up on the south side of the city around 75th and Calumet. And I used to see the sign in front of Trinity United Church of Christ that said, "Free South Africa, Free South Africa." And I think maybe in elementary school, maybe 8th grade, maybe high school. And I was thinking to myself, okay, Free South Africa, what's that about? I really wasn't sure because I was focused on what was going on in my neighborhood, what high school I was going to go to. And so one of the things that was really, really fulfilling for me was to be able to go back to Reverend Jeremiah Wright and say, what was that sign about? I never knew the history about that. I was not a member of Trinity, but I knew that there were people who were, but I didn't really begin to know some of those people until later on when I was in college. So it was really a full circle moment for me to come back and talk to him about why that church was so pivotal in some of the social justice issues that they were facing. And again, I think you'll see in the documentary when a lot of those South Africans who had actually been imprisoned on Robben Island with Nelson Mandela came back, that was the church that they came back to, because that was the church that had really, really been involved. I think one of the stories that he tells, which, I didn't know, and that was that there were other Black churches that he went to and said, hey, put this sign up. And they said no. And so it really goes to this issue of we expect churches to be on the front lines of what's right, but that's not always the case. And so I think we have to be critical about our churches as well when they don't do what they say they're about. And so that action to me is really, really important. It's not just talk, it's really action.
One of the things I love about Chicago is the rich history of action within the church. The church getting out on the streets, helping people, loving people. That always, as you said, hasn't always been the most rosy picture, but there's a lot of people that really care about that and really get out there. Speaking of, tell us more about Reverend Jeremiah Wright and his 3,000 postcards.
Yeah, so he talks in the documentary about putting together these postcards, wanting to send them to all the Black churches in Chicago, both on the South and West sides, and just asking them to put a sign in front of their church, similar to what they had done that says "Free South Africa." This was, as he saw it, and as many groups saw it, as a sort of a wake up, an awakening for people. You're just coming out of the civil rights movement, and yes, we know there's still all kinds of inequities in the city of Chicago, mostly along racial lines, but also around socioeconomic lines. And so we're coming out of this situation where you really have to educate people and you have to raise their consciousness levels about this. And so he felt that these signs, as well as other Free South Africa organizations, said, okay, let's put these signs up so that people's consciousness will be raised. And I think you heard one of the couples in there, the Mustons, say, he put that sign up so that everybody could see it. And even if they didn't know what it was about, they would be asking questions. Well, what is this Free South Africa? And so when he sent these postcards out to all these churches, again, most of them said, no, I'm not going to put the sign up. And so we never know today what else might have been going on with those churches. There's always some political things that are happening behind the scenes that often we as congregants don't necessarily know what it's about. But, I think about Black Lives Matter today. And the fact that now we see all these signs, right? Black Lives Matter signs in front of some churches, some synagogues, some other houses of worship. But then there are lots of those religious organizations that don't have the sign up. So, in the end, I think it's up to those individual congregations to, yes, the sign is symbolic, but the question is always, what are you doing behind the scenes that actually addresses some of the inequities? And so that was a story about many Black churches choosing not to. And, one of the persons that I interviewed that didn't get into the documentary in terms of his comment about this was, he reminded me that Black churches historically, not just in Chicago, have been relatively conservative on certain issues. And I don't think we always necessarily think of the Black church in that way. And so that was really a reminder that we cannot paint all groups, all religious bodies with the same broad brush. They are not homogenous groups, and that's okay. And that's what makes the world go round, right? Is that we have variety there.
Nelson Mandela was released from prison in 1990. He came to the US and visited, but he did not visit Chicago. Can you tell us a little bit about why he chose not to, or why that visit didn't happen?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I was a news reporter at WFLA TV in Tampa in 1990, and I remember they sent me up north to Atlanta to cover Nelson Mandela's visit to the city of Atlanta. So this is 1990. He's just been released. He's released in February. He starts his tour of the United States in June and July. He visits all these cities, Los Angeles, all these other places, New York, but he doesn't come to Chicago. And so as some of the organizers explained, their biggest concern was that the Daley administration would not provide adequate security for Nelson Mandela. You got to remember, Nelson Mandela was considered a terrorist, right? One of the reasons he was jailed for 27 years was because the South African government felt as though he was going to try to blow up the country. And this is one of the reasons that they jailed him. There was an attempt to actually blow up some electrical grid. So today we have a view of Nelson Mandela as this person who's a saint, right? Well, the truth is people are more complicated than that. And I'm sure if he were here, he would say, I needed to do something to get the white government's attention because Black people were really getting killed and maimed and again, just not having political rights. But that opportunity to, again, take over the country in that way was really what got him imprisoned. And so I think when he came, or there was talk of him coming in 1990, and he didn't get the kind of security or that the Daley administration, and this is, Daley, the second Daley, did not provide the kind of security that the organizers felt he needed. They said, we're not going to do it. We're not going to do it in Chicago. But then 3 years later, there's a change of heart. And obviously the kind of security they wanted was now offered, and they felt it was safe for him to come to the city of Chicago. And so, I did attempt as a journalist to try to get the other side of the story, which is, what does the former Mayor Daley have to say about that. Unfortunately, after going through several different people, no one ever got back to me. And I tried multiple times to try to get someone to have something, to say on that issue. But be that as it may, he did eventually come to Chicago. And I think that's really what's so important. And he came not just to thank the people, but also to raise money, because he was about to run the first, campaign in modern history for the African National Congress. And it's expensive. We talked today about how expensive it is to run an election. It was expensive too in 1994 as well. And so, that was one of his goals, and the various dinners that were sponsored and the events, in addition to being able to see someone who had spent, almost 3 decades in prison. It was also a fundraiser to support the ANC and the elections, which would take place the following year in 1994.
Your film highlights how Nelson Mandela's visit to Chicago in 1993 was somewhat bittersweet. Tell us about what made that more complicated than maybe we might have thought or we remember even today.
Well, bittersweet in the sense that a lot of the people who had really helped to organize the visit weren't necessarily invited to be a part of that. Rachel Rubin, who is in the documentary and started out her consciousness raising actually as a high school student in Evanston, talks about how there was this feeling that those who really were in the trenches and raising the consciousness level and holding meetings and really living, breathing all of this activism didn't really get a prominent role in a lot of the festivities that occurred when he arrived. And I think that's what was somewhat bittersweet about it. But I think they also understood that, this is an international figure, and those people who really wanted to be seen with Nelson Mandela for a photo op, they were coming out of the woodwork. And I think that was the bittersweet part that many of the activists who had been on the ground really felt about it. But in the end, they understood it was just, it's just par for the course, so to speak. And you should kind of expect that to happen when you have a figure as prominent, as important, and as well known as Nelson Mandela come to your city.
Nelson Mandela is a hero to many people, but your film ends with a little bit of a sense of disappointment that he didn't talk more about racism in America. Yeah. Was it difficult to include that in your film? Broadly, your film's very uplifting. Was it tough to include that part at the end?
Well, as a journalist, though, it wasn't so tough. I mean, certainly, you worry about, are people going to think of him differently, as they watch this film? But truth is truth. And, there was the evidence of what he said in that Nightline episode. What was really difficult was actually to get that video, to find that video. But I felt it was so important to corroborate what Harry's memory was. And because that makes it even stronger when people can hear for themselves him saying something rather than relying on somebody's secondhand to say, well, this is how I remember it. So I think one of the questions that's often posed about these figures is how perfect they are. Well, nobody's perfect. The situation is not perfect. He probably did the best he could. Some people in South Africa still talk about how maybe the political equality that Blacks were striving for in South Africa was focused on too much and not enough focus on the economic parity that's really necessary. And, if people have been following, within the last week, there's just been major upheaval, rioting and looting going on in South Africa. And it's, as a result of corruption in the government. The previous president, Jacob Zuma, who was accused of all kinds of corruption, also accused of rape, and taking money and then bringing other corrupt people in, so that South Africa's electrical grid, for example, they have blackouts all the time. The government had said, okay, you've got to pay a price for this. We want you to come and testify. And if you don't testify, you're going to jail. And so he chose not to testify. And that's what sparked a lot of the uprising that we're seeing there. And on top of that, you've got COVID outbreaks, and the vaccination rate the last time I checked, was hovering around 5%. So, we in the United States talk about, could we get to 70%? We're only at 50%. Well, how about if you only are at 5%? That really changes the circumstances under which you can operate on a daily basis. And so I've been to South Africa 11 times. And when I leave there, I always feel conflicted, because on the one hand, I see this young democracy. I see, yes, Black people have the right to vote, but I also see extreme poverty and extreme disparity between the haves and the have-nots. And I leave there just feeling unsettled about going to communities where they don't have running water, and they don't have indoor plumbing, and they don't have electricity. So their kids have to, do their homework in kerosene lights, and the kerosene lights tip over, meaning, you have a fire that occurs that didn't need to happen if there had been an infrastructure there really for a majority of the people. So like I said, I just feel as though, to some degree, putting that in, I thought was very important. And I also thought that it was very important to include Harry Lennox's comments about, if he had it to do over again, he probably would not have focused on that, because he felt like charity begins at home. And so I think it was a situation where I felt I had to put it in, because if he's thinking that way, I bet there are other people who are thinking that way. They just weren't willing to necessarily come forward for the documentary. And I think we live in a world where, again, these issues are complex. There's some gray areas, but I think we have to begin to really grapple with this complexity and try to figure out what's the way forward.
How did the process of making this film impact you personally?
So, two things. One, I had already mentioned about the sign, and really I felt like, okay, now I have license to actually be nosy, to be curious, to really say, what really happened here? Why were there not more signs? Because he's right. I mean, I attended a church, St. John, on the South Side, and I never remember us even having any conversations about South Africa. So it really made me realize that some churches are really much more in the forefront of these current day issues than others. And it also made me think how, what kind of religious tradition is really, really important. Is activism, especially today when it comes to BLM, how important is that to me? And so it made me question all of those things. I think one of the most difficult aspects, though, of the documentary was trying to include as many people as possible, but making the decision that you got to cut it off. It can't go on, and you got to compress and only take some of those areas that were really, really, really pivotal and most important in the themes, and string those together. So, like I said, I started in 2016 and finished in 2020. So this is a 4-year endeavor. One of my goals is I want young people, school children, to see this documentary, because I think often, we think that the people who are doing the work are so far removed from where we are. And these are people who were in their own backyards, and not all of them were famous, but they decided to make a difference, and they decided to do something. And I think when children, young people, young adults see that, they ask themselves, what can I do? I'm not a Nelson Mandela. I'm not, a Jesse Jackson, but I am who I am. And that's good enough to actually make a difference in the lives of the people in your immediate community, but also in the lives of people beyond your immediate community. The internet has really brought us closer in some ways to understanding what's going on in other parts of the world. We saw what just happened in Haiti. We see what's happening in South Africa. We see what happened in Germany with the floods. We see what happened in India in terms of COVID-19 and how India is impacting the Olympics in Tokyo. So we're all connected, right? We see that, but sometimes I think it's easy to forget that we do need to be concerned about other people outside of our immediate presence. And I think we can do both, right? We can be concerned about and do some things about here at home, but also think about what we can do for other people who need more assistance or just need some assistance.
I love that. I agree. I think it's so important for us to be really critical of our personal circles of influence and the different actions that we might be able to take within those circles, um, even if it's small. It's something.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's something, right? And a little bit of something coupled with somebody else's little bit of something can actually be a lot of something. And I think that's, something that even I forget sometimes, and I have to be reminded of it. And so I'm hoping in some way that the documentary reminds people, young and not so young, that we all can do something. We just have to figure out what fits best for us.
Thank you, Dr. Greenwell, for sharing your film with us. I'm Lia Smith for Different Drummers and the Greater Chicago Broadcast Ministries. Keep the faith.